Okay, because they're a hybrid class, so I'm supposed to be doing half of my class online with them. I'm trying to record with Echo 360 with kind of mixed results. Problem with Echo 360 is I have to use this camera over here, which only points at me if I'm in front of the computer and doesn't do the board. I recorded one of our classes last week, and none of this showed up. So I've got my camera phone here. All right, so we talked about the Chesapeake, Maryland, right? We talked about how ultimately Lord Baltimore wants this to be a safe haven for Catholics. He wants them to come in as rent-paying peasants. He doesn't want to give them self-governance. He wants to own this like his own feudal domain. During the 1640s, England is going to be racked by civil war. So pretty much Maryland is left on its own for 10 years to kind of sort this out on their own. And more Protestants than Catholics end up going to Maryland, and they're motivated by money. They want to be like tobacco farmers from Virginia. But because Maryland never adopts anything like the headright system, it's going to take them longer to become successful, wealthy tobacco farmers. And there's going to be actually quite a lot of violence. There's Carrie. Between Protestants and Catholics in the 1640s during England's Civil War. So there's going to be like a mini Civil War in Maryland. At the end, Lord Baltimore Jr., Lord Baltimore II, grants the right to private land ownership, the right to form their own colonial assembly, like the House of Burgesses, and religious toleration. So this will be the first instance of religion. I think it's 1652. I don't have my phone. My phone is being used. Got to Google it. Ads plus. My ad blocker's on. Refresh. Oh, 1649. Okay. I was off by 3 years. So 1649, Lord Baltimore II gives in and allows much more self-governance so that the colonists in Maryland can essentially be like the colonists in Virginia. He also issues a proclamation of religious tolerance for all Christians. This is, of course, going to precede the establishment of Pennsylvania with broad religious tolerance by more than 30 years. So for Europe at the time, that's revolutionary. 1649 is the height of the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire. What's now Austria, Germany, Luxembourg. There's another one of these small little burgs in there. We're all racked by religious warfare between Catholics and Protestants as the Holy Roman Empire completely disintegrated. And at the end of the 30 Years' War, 20% of the population, mostly civilian, is dead by the end of the 30 Years' War. So at the same time that some of the worst of the religious warfare in Europe is going on, Lord Baltimore relents and gives religious tolerance between Catholics and Protestants after this kind of little mini peace, civil war in Maryland between Catholics and Protestants. Ironically, because he gives them the right to self-governance and forming their own colonial assembly, because Protestants outnumber Catholics, even though they don't override this edict of religious tolerance, they do prohibit building Catholic churches on public lands. So they end up screwing the Catholics in the end. But gradually, Maryland is going to just replicate the Chesapeake. All right, New England. So we talked about New England. Guys in funny hats. All right, so ultimately, going to be a lot different than the Chesapeake, largely because they come as whole families and communities. They're bound together by this sense of mission, religious mission. Makes for a much more stable society. So a life expectancy, even though early on the Pilgrims have a pretty rough time because it's so friggin' cold in New England. They can't even grow the crops that they bring with them. It's too cold. It's so much colder than England itself that they starve. Many of them starve that first winter until Squanto and the other Indians help them figure out how to grow crops native to the Americas. So they switch to corn, squash, pumpkins, which is actually a form of squash. And of course, fishing, supplemented by fishing, that's going to help them survive and lay the groundwork for a successful model for these guys. Because of the geography, too cold for tobacco, but also too rocky a soil, too steep a terrain for large commercial farming, they set up small farms, small family farms, centered around villages for the local economy, not commercial agriculture. They do commercial fishing. Initially, they start fishing just to feed themselves, but growing population in Europe, growing demand for fishing, they dry, salt, and export dried fish. That leads, because of the dense forest in the area, they're able to build boats, later build ships, and New England is going to become the center of the shipbuilding industry in the colonies. It's also going to become the center then for commerce and trade. So by the 1700s, the majority of ships sailing between England and the colonies, or between the colonies themselves, were manufactured in New England, owned by New England merchants, and mostly with crews from New England. So they're going to come to New England's going to come to dominate the commercial shipping business in the colonies. We'll talk about, when we talk about things that bring the colonies together, we'll talk about English trade policies and how initially these guys grumble over some of these trade policies, but ultimately they end up benefiting because they get a monopoly over trade. Rum, talked about rum, particularly in Rhode Island, and self-governance, that from the Mayflower Compact on, they're going to follow the model up to an extent of Jamestown and or Virginia and having self-governance, but with a difference. Rather than tying voting to land ownership, because they all own land anyway, it's going to be tied to church membership. Everybody has to live within a half a mile of the church. Everyone has to attend church. Church service is mandatory. All male church members, and your authors talk about this process of becoming a member of the church. You have to kind of be accepted as a member by sharing your conversion story. All male church members get the right to vote. So, and they're all part of this mission. And at least early on, while they're all coming over for this same mission, this idea that they need to create a perfect society as an example to save England from its wicked ways, it's going to create a very stable social environment, right? So they end up thriving. In many respects, if you just look at life expectancy, New England is going to be one of the most successful colonial regions. They end up having a higher life expectancy and literacy rates than people back in England or the rest of Europe. So from that standpoint, right, mission accomplished. But later on, as you get a more diverse population starting to emerge in New England, people who don't feel the same sense of mission, you start getting tension within New England society and persecution, religious persecution. In fact, as early as 1632, when they banished Anne Hutchinson to Rhode Island for arguing that women should have an equal voice in the church, you start to see the way in which this sense of mission can also be used to persecute people who don't have that same sense of mission. And of course, the most radical example of that is the Salem witch trials. Lucky Anne Hutchinson, right? I mean, yeah, she dies and gets sick and dies in Rhode Island, but she would have faced a much grimmer death a few generations later if she had been trying to argue that women should have equal rights in the 1670s rather than in the 1630s. They would have burned her as a witch. So, same with Roger Williams, right? Roger Williams, the founder of the American Baptist movement, argues that baptism should be reserved for adults who have, as part of becoming a member of the church, that until you can demonstrate that you understand the tenets of the church, you shouldn't be baptized. That should be part of the ritual of becoming a church member. He gets banished to Rhode Island, right? So if he had been saying this in the 1670s, he probably would have been burned as a witch too. So over time, as the population becomes more diverse, the sense of reaction to that diversity becomes more extreme. All right, Middle Colonies. Not a terribly original name. Because it's just in the middle, right? Chesapeake's going to be the first colonies, then New England. And the Middle Colonies don't become English until the 1660s. Initially, they were Dutch. The first Dutch settlement is going to be Fort Nassau in 1614, but the much more influential one, New Amsterdam, 1624. So Henry Hudson, an Englishman. This is early on when Holland and England are still allies in the Protestant Reformation against Spain. Henry Hudson leads an expedition funded by a Dutch corporation to explore and find a way around North America. That's his mission, is to find the Northwest Passage. So when he sails up the Hudson River, he's hoping, of course he names it after himself, he's hoping that this will be a water route around North America. He gets as far as modern-day Albany, New York, and that's as far as he can sail. But that's a pretty far way to sail in a sailboat that's capable of crossing the Atlantic. So the Hudson River is navigable most of its length. Like the French, the Dutch then are going to mostly be interested in trade with the Indians. So do they need to send a large population to establish plantations? Right, it's too cold to grow tobacco. But there is fur, right? Like the French, they find Indians willing to trade. And of course, that's going to be what sets up New Amsterdam. Did we talk about them buying Manhattan? No, we didn't get that far. Okay. You guys, how many of you guys have heard the story of the Dutch buying Manhattan? Mm-hmm. The Dutch like to, try and, at this point out that they're different than the English. The English, right, in Jamestown, from the beginning have conflict with the Indians and don't really compensate the Indians for the land they acquire. The Dutch like to point out that they bought Manhattan Island from the Indians. There's Henry Hudson, or not the Henry Hudson, one of the later groups is sailing along the Hudson River, and they find this group of guys fishing on the coast, and somehow they negotiated a deal where they purchased the entire island for some selling iron axes and some glass beads and some wool blankets. Anyone see any problems with that story? They find a couple of guys fishing on the coast, and how do they make this deal? Do the Indians understand this deal? First, do the Indians have a concept of private ownership of property?
No.
No. What about language?
Yeah.
Would that really convey, even if they have someone who can speak some of the native language, how easy is it to translate this kind of legal concept? And of course they can't read the contract, even if you're translating it for them. Also, do these guys even have the authority to make the deal? They're just a couple of guys fishing. Right? If I'm fishing on Lake Pat Cleburne with my kids, and you sail up in a party boat and offer me 2 cases of Bud Light for all of Cleburne, and I take the Bud Light and sign the contract, do you now own Cleburne? Well, you got a contract. You bought it from me. I didn't have, did I have the authority to make the deal? So there's all sorts of kind of questions about this story that the Dutch like to harp back on, how they bought Manhattan Island. So they're going to build New Amsterdam. Of course, it's not just going to be Dutch. There's going to be people, merchants, interested in the fur trade. They kind of open up settlement to pretty much anyone who wants to take part. It's a commercial venture. So Scandinavians, particularly people from Sweden, English settlers, even some French Protestants come to settle in New Amsterdam. I'll talk, that's later after the English sees it. The Dutch do bring some slaves with them, but if they convert to Christianity, they free them. So from the beginning, New Amsterdam has a not insignificant population of free black former slaves. So it's a very kind of diverse population. Mostly interested in the fur trade, but also a little bit in the tobacco trade. New England or Dutch merchants in New Amsterdam used New Amsterdam as kind of a base of operations, not just to trade fur, but also to buy tobacco from the Chesapeake to import into Holland and process and package and ship in Europe. That, of course, is why the English are going to increasingly see this as a thorn in their side, because strategically it separates their big money maker down here from New England. Economically, they see this as cutting into the profits that England makes from the tobacco trade. So that's why increasingly England is going to see Holland as a threat rather than as an ally. And we saw some of that a little bit earlier on, right? 1620, King James sends the Pilgrims to settle on the Hudson River to kind of block the Dutch, to kind of secure England's claim to this area as part of Virginia. Of course, they get lost and end up here, and New England ends up kind of separated from Virginia by what is increasingly becoming this Dutch colony. So how do the English acquire it? Get it the good old-fashioned way. They steal it. Not New Holland, Netherlands. I'm trying to get the exact date. I'm thinking 1664. Yep, 1664. Hey, my memory's not as bad as I thought. So 1664. Charles II acquires New Netherlands as a result of a war with Holland. This wasn't just a war about North America. Chapter 5 made an announcement about that question. I accidentally checked the box for the wrong answer, so I got to go back in and give credit for people who got the right answer. But I didn't like that question very much about what were England's imperial goals. I forgot the exact wording in the late 1600s, early to mid 1700s. And the answer that the textbook has is control of North America. England had global ambitions, not just in North America, but also in the Caribbean, in India, and trade with China. The first of these conflicts then is going to be between England and Holland, not just over North America, but also with trade with India, China, Japan, and Indonesia. As a result, kind of like the Spanish and the Portuguese did with the Treaty of Tordesillas, the English and the Dutch come up with an agreement to split their spheres of influence. Holland will get sole right to trade in Japan. England will give up its trading rights in Japan. Holland will get control of Indonesia. England will get control of India. Holland gives up its efforts to set up trading posts in India, and England gets New Holland or New Netherlands. So this is so the English and the Dutch kind of trade in commercial interests around the world. So yes, part of this, and then later England and France are going to go. England, France, and Spain and Portugal are going to be competing as well. And there's going to be a series of wars, not just about the Americas, but also about the Caribbean. England steals Jamaica from France. First, France steals Jamaica from the Spanish, then England steals Jamaica from the French, and now Jamaica is part of the English Commonwealth. The English drive the Portuguese out of India. It's not, I don't like that question that the textbook had in its review questions, because England's goals are much bigger than just North America. They're looking at controlling global trade in Asia as well. Later on, the English take over the Dutch colony of Cape Town in South Africa. So the Dutch were the first ones to start colonizing South Africa. The English come in and take it from the Dutch. So, all right, so they steal it the good old-fashioned way. And since before, did I talk about the English Civil War? Yeah, I did a little bit, right, when I talked about Maryland, and talked about a little bit about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So 1625, James dies, his son Charles becomes king. Charles I was, his mom was Catholic, and he himself had Catholic sympathies. So one of the problems Lord Baltimore faces in trying to attract Catholics to Maryland is Charles isn't persecuting Catholics. So why leave England if you're not being persecuted? One of the reasons that the Puritans decide to leave England in 1630 is if you can't convince a Lutheran like King James to ditch Catholic remnants in the Church of England, how are you going to convince Charles, who's sympathetic to Catholics? So Charles is going to be kind of one of the motivators for both, or have a big influence on both Maryland and New England. But he's also, though, wants to rule as an absolute monarch. He wants to rule as the sole power in England. He wants to take power away from Parliament. First, he starts passing laws to raise taxes without consulting Parliament. Ever since the Magna Carta, since the nobles had rebelled against King John in 1215, the right to raise taxes and pass bills of spending had been reserved for Parliament. Edward III had expanded Parliament to include all landowners in the House of Commons. So the idea of no taxation without representation is going to become a cornerstone of the American Revolution, was firmly entrenched in the English Constitution and common law. So King Charles trying to raise taxes without consulting Parliament led to Parliament bitching at the king. You can't do this, it's not legal. So in 1638, Charles just dissolves Parliament. He said, I don't need you anymore, you're fired, I'll go home. Members of Parliament, of course, don't like that, and they rebel. So in the 1640s, from 1640 through 1649, England is going to be racked by civil war. Members loyal to Parliament are rebelling against the king. And there's going to be a religious component to this as well, because many of the forces that ultimately join the side of Parliament are Puritans, led by Oliver Cromwell.
They're nicknamed the Roundheads because to keep lice and fleas down and the risk of spreading infection and disease in his troops, he has his troops cut their hair short, which was not fashionable. Guys had long hair in the 1600s. If they wanted it out of the way, they'd put it up in a ponytail, right? So guys did not close crop their hair. So he's the first person to really kind of look at hygiene in the military to cut down on disease. He also much more effectively implements the use of gunpowder weapons amongst his troops. Ultimately, the forces of Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, overthrow King Charles. They try him for treason. How can you try the king for treason? He's the king. Not only do they find him guilty, they chop his head off. So they execute King Charles. Parliament tries to rule for 10 years without a king. They appoint Oliver Cromwell as the Lord Protector, as kind of an executive, yeah.
So what do they charge him guilty of?
Violating the English Constitution.
Okay.
So you've betrayed the English people. By violating the Magna Carta and the common law tradition.
But he's the king.
He's the king, yes.
Okay.
So they try him and find him guilty and chop his head off.
Oh.
So his son Charles flees into exile, goes to France. Although he retains the title Duke of York. Duke of York, Charles II, is in exile in France. Oliver Cromwell is appointed Lord Protector and fairly quickly accrues power to him through control of the military and creation of a new police force to enforce a strict Puritan morality in England. He's a Puritan. He wants to abolish not only all of the Catholic remnants in the Church of England, so they get rid of stained glass windows, gilt, they get rid of the Mass and all the sacraments. They abolish all holidays except for Christmas and Easter. They try to get rid of Christmas. They hate Christmas. Why do they hate Christmas? What's wrong with Christmas? They argue it's fundamentally un-Christian. Even though it celebrates the birth of Jesus, even then religious scholars knew that if you actually examine the Bible, books of Mark and Luke, that Jesus was most likely born in the spring, not the winter. But the Romans had changed the holiday or the date to December to compete with other religious holidays prevalent in the empire. So it was a act of kind of political marketing by the Roman state rather than based on fact. And many of the traditions of Halloween, they argue, were pagan in origin. Yes, Santa Claus is based on St. Nicholas, who is from Turkey, but the images of Father Christmas often borrow from Odin, the All-Father, a big white bearded dude. His 8 reindeer represent the 8-headed horse that Odin rides. The Christmas tree was a pagan celebration of Yule, the Yule season at the winter solstice. And of course, Christmas was often celebrated with drunken parties and revelry, which these guys hate. They argue that Christmas just invites bad behavior, so they want to get rid of Christmas. It's so popular, though, that they can't get rid of it. But they get rid of Halloween and all the other holidays, except for Easter. They also closed down all the bars in England. No more drinking. They closed down some of the breweries and distilleries so that you don't manufacture. They start trying to just even stamp out the manufacture of alcohol. They closed down, of course, all the brothels and gambling houses. Also, all of the theaters. This is a generation after Shakespeare. They closed down all of the theaters. They see theaters as a den of iniquity and licentiousness as well. So after 10 years of this kind of Christian Taliban rule in England, the English people have had enough. When Cromwell dies and tries to pass on power to his son, Parliament's like, nah, we need a balance of power. We need to create a balance of power between Parliament and the executive. So we need an independent executive. We need the king. We need to bring the king back. So they bring back Charles, Duke of York, make him King of England, and he's going to go to war with the Dutch and acquire New Holland, or excuse me, New Netherlands. Renames New Amsterdam after himself, New York, he's the Duke of York. And initially the whole territory, New York, which is really confusing. At least the Dutch called it New Netherlands and New Amsterdam, not New York and New York, right? Which New York are you talking about? The city or the state, right? The colony. He owed money though to the Lord of Jersey. So he sold the southern half to the guy who he owed money to, who renamed it New Jersey, because again, they're English and they're not terribly original. New Jersey briefly broke into an East and West Jersey because the Lord of Jersey also owed money to somebody else, so he gave land away. But these are all initially going to be proprietor colonies like Maryland. Charles expects that the colonists will pay him rent for the privilege of settling on his land in New York. And he doesn't want to give them self-governance. He wants to govern this territory directly as a feudal lord, like Lord Baltimore had tried in Maryland. So initially, he doesn't attract a whole lot of new settlers. Some people go over because, okay, so the Dutch are interested in money. What's the geography like? Before I get on to looking at the next wave of settlers. Dang it, I hate when this time's out. Let's see, where's mine? Here, Google Maps. Google Earth. All right, first looking at climate. blue screen of death. Abracadabra. Okay. So if you kind of ignore upstate New York here for a moment, and kind of focus on kind of the lower valley of the Hudson River in New Jersey, Pennsylvania here. What would you infer about the climate compared to the Chesapeake and New England? Is it going to be as cold as New England? Is it going to be as hot as the Chesapeake? Right? So from a European standpoint then, this is kind of the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold. It's warm enough that they can grow crops from Europe, like wheat. It's warm enough for wheat farming. Too cold to grow wheat up here, have to rely on corn, but you can grow wheat here. Also, the valleys, it's more, a little bit more rolling terrain in the before you get to the Appalachians, like the Chesapeake, not as steep and rocky here. So more broad valleys suitable for farmland, but also for raising dairy cattle. So farming, so much more suitable for farming. However, it's too cold for tobacco. So it's warm enough to grow European crops, but too cold for tobacco. There's going to be some commercial farming, but not large-scale tobacco plantations like in New England. The Hudson River, of course, is navigable its full length, and much of the economy up in here is still going to focus on the fur trade. But lower New York, New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, ideally suited for European-style farming. So more than either the Chesapeake or New England, this is going to allow Europeans to kind of replicate European society and economies on kind of the local village level. Got some good harbors, New York City Harbor, the Delaware River up to where Philadelphia is. The Delaware River is navigable fairly far inland. River transportation is fairly good as well. I'm just going to put Goldilocks zone for geography. Yeah, you get into western Pennsylvania and it starts getting much more mountainous once you get into the Appalachians. But at least in the coastal areas, the lower Hudson River Valley, Delaware River Valley, it's ideally suited to kind of replicate European-style farming. So that's going to attract some settlers wanting land to farm, but also, at least in New York, to continue making money off the fur trade. That's going to be kind of the main draw initially. William Penn is going to radically change this, though, in 1681. They don't actually settle the colony until 1682, but in 1681, William Penn acquires large territory in here from King Charles with permission to move religious dissidents there. Who does he want to help out? Who does William Penn want to help? What's that? Everyone? Well, he ends up helping everyone because, you know, it's part of his religious belief, but he's a Quaker. So he's motivated by religion. I'm going to put a little. What's a good sign for nationalism?
The world.
I'm going to do a Welsh dragon here. He's also got a little Welsh nationalism thrown in. There's my crappy drawing of a Welsh dragon. Okay, so technically, Wales was part of Britain. It had been conquered by Edward I in the 1280s. The Prince of Wales was the heir apparent to the throne of England, but Wales had a strong independence streak. In fact, for 13 years in the early 1400s, Wales had a fairly successful rebellion and independence movement against English rule under Owain Glyndwr. Almost destroyed England. Ultimately, though, fails. So William Penn himself is Welsh. Most of the Quakers he attracts early on are Welsh. So he not only wants religious freedom for Quakers, but he wants to create a refuge for the Welsh. Under Cromwell, the English government had started to take efforts to try to exterminate Welsh identity, banning the use of the Welsh language in public schools or in courts, imposing the use of English as the official language in Wales in an effort to forcibly assimilate the Welsh population to make them English. So Penn wants to create a new Wales. In fact, his idea is to call it New Cymru. Cymru is the Welsh word for Wales. Welsh actually comes from the Old English word for foreigner. So Wales is the land of the foreigners from an English perspective. I put this then in so religious freedom, but also he wants to attract a Welsh settler. Something that very few of the textbooks, or none of the textbooks I've used really talk a whole lot about. But I've got a folder in web links called titled "The Welsh in America," and they've got a few articles about the importance of the Welsh in William Penn's original settlement in Pennsylvania. He doesn't want to call it Pennsylvania. Charles insists. He makes it part of the deal. If I'm going to sell you this land for you to move all these Quakers and Welshmen there, you have to call it Pennsylvania. Not to name it after you, but because I love your dad so much. William Penn's dad had been an admiral in the British Navy, and he was the one responsible for defeating the Dutch, leading to Charles' acquisition of New Netherlands. So all of this territory wouldn't have been English in the first place, or acquired by England in the first place, if it wasn't for William Penn's dad. So Charles thinks, I'm doing you a favor, kind of repaying the favor I owe your dad by selling you all this land. But because I'm doing this really because I feel grateful to your dad, you have to call it after your dad, Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. William Penn is kind of a humble guy. He really resists this. He doesn't want anyone thinking that he's some big egomaniac calling his colony after himself, but the king insists. So he attracts Quakers. Why weren't the Quakers popular back in England? They had some pretty unpopular ideas. Like the Congregationalists, They think their community should be self-governing and simple church services, right? They don't like the extravagance of the Church of England. They don't like the top-down bureaucracy of the church. They want to be self-governing. But unlike the Puritans, they think everybody who are Calvinists and think in the predestination, you're either saved or damned, and there's nothing you can do about it. The Quakers believe that everybody has the possibility of salvation, that you have this inner light, that you can be see the grace of God and be saved. So kind of that much more Lutheran view. They also believe, therefore, they also then believe that your ultimate loyalty is to God, not the state. Ooh, why wouldn't a king like Charles like that? Your ultimate loyalty is to your religious beliefs, not to the state. What happened to Charles's dad? Because a bunch of people didn't like him. He got his head chopped off, right? So that's not very popular. They also believe that the injunction in the Bible, "Thou shalt not kill," shall be taken absolutely literally. That war is a sin, and therefore that they should not be bound to military service. They're going to be the first conscientious objectors. They're going to argue that war is a sin, and therefore they should not be obligated to serve in the military. Which, of course, if you're King Charles, sets a terrible example. Yeah.
Do they also not believe in death as punishment?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're also going to be the first ones, although these initially they don't have much of a problem with slavery. Eventually, they're going to be the first ones to argue that slavery is a moral evil as well. They're going to argue that God created all men in His image and women, and therefore God loves everyone equally, and therefore owning a person is a sin. Initially, they don't have any problem with slavery, but they're going to kind of develop as the first anti-slave people who argue against slavery on moral grounds. They also think that women should have an equal voice in the church, that women should be equals. Ooh, how does that go over with all of the dudes back in England? I gotta give my wife equal say. Oh man, no. So the Quakers are pretty revolutionary for their time. They have a lot of unpopular ideas. But since I'm going to go all the way down here too. Farming, fur trade. Banking. Philadelphia is going to become kind of the commercial center in terms of banking. So William Penn decides, even before the first colonists go over there, when he sets up the rules for his colony, religious tolerance. You can have any religion. Because the Quakers don't believe in forcing you to convert. For your salvation to be sincere, you have to voluntarily, you have to harbor that inner light and be saved, not forced, right? So the idea of forcing people to believe in God runs against their fundamental religious beliefs. So they're going to have broad-based religious tolerance. You can be any religion or none. You could be atheist if you wanted, which would have been really radical anywhere. Atheists would have been burned by everybody back in Europe. Jews were facing persecution in Europe at the time, on again and off again, ever since the Middle Ages and the First Crusade. you can be Jewish in Pennsylvania. In fact, the first synagogue in what's now the United States was constructed in Philadelphia in the 1680s. So the oldest synagogue in the United States is in Philadelphia. You can be Muslim. This is at a time when the Ottoman Empire is still fighting against Christian Europe. You can be Muslim in Pennsylvania. This is right after that 30 Years' War has destroyed the Holy Roman Empire and created a patchwork of independent states throughout Central Europe, in which the political authority can dictate what religion you are. That's the deal for the end of the 30 Years' War. It creates a patchwork of sovereign states, and the state can determine the religion of its inhabitants. This idea then of religious tolerance is going to serve as a beacon, not just then for Quakers, but every religious dissenting group. Baptists, right, who don't fit in here can move down here. The Baptist movement had spread from Rhode Island back to England. So Baptists from England, rather than face persecution in New England, can go to Pennsylvania. And because it's this kind of Goldilocks zone, you don't have to change your lifestyle all that much. You can just do what you're doing back in England or Germany, do the same business, just do it in Pennsylvania. He also allows self-governance. Initially, that's to try and attract these Welsh settlers. He promises them self-governance with the idea that they will create a new Wales in Pennsylvania. And if you look around the Philadelphia area, most of the place names around Philadelphia, the towns, the counties, are all named in Welsh. But eventually, because of this broad-based religious tolerance, the Welsh immigrants are going to get outnumbered by the non-Welsh, by English and German, and later Scots-Irish. So English. Oh, and then one of the great, I'm going to call them Scotch-Irish, even though there's been a movement by historians to call them Scots-Irish. What's the difference? What's a Scot and what is Scotch? What's the difference? One's a drink, right? Whiskey. And one's a person. So if you refer to a Scotsman as Scotch, they'll get really offended nowadays. But in the 1600s and 1700s, the English referred to the Scots as Scotch. In fact, in the 1690s, when these guys first started showing up in Pennsylvania, and are referred to as the Scotch-Irish, the Scots didn't even make much whiskey. 90% of the global production of whiskey was in Ireland. And in fact, the Irish are going to later complain that the Scots can't really call what they make whiskey, because for it to be whiskey, it needs to be single malt, and it should be from Ireland. And there's going to be actually a special commission appointed in the 1850s by Parliament to settle the great whiskey debate, whether or not Scotch whiskey can actually be called whiskey. These guys take their whiskey seriously, right? So at the time, it would have not been considered a slur to call them Scotch-Irish. And the term itself is inaccurate as well, because they're not all Scots, and they're not really all from Ireland. Although by 1690, most of them were born in Ireland. But the Germans, like the Mennonites and the Amish, come over to flee religious persecution back in Germany, but they get mislabeled. The Welsh and English settlers don't call them German or refer to them as German. Because how do you say German in German, the German language? Deutsch. And how would you refer to Germany then? So from the English perspective, where does it sound like these people are from? They're Dutch. They're they must be from Holland. So these people end up being called the Pennsylvania Dutch. So like Scotch-Irish, it's not a very accurate name, the Pennsylvania Dutch. Ben Franklin complains about them later on. He claims that since they don't speak English, they're undermining the English identity of Pennsylvania. Of course, the irony there is that if you go all the way back to the founding of Pennsylvania, the first colonists would have been complaining about Ben Franklin speaking English because they wanted everyone to speak Welsh. So ultimately, Pennsylvania becomes more English in culture because that's the common language. And we'll talk about that with the colonies in general. So the Scotch-Irish, to talk about them. So when King James became James I, King of Scotland and England, he had to do something about this border region. For hundreds of years, Scotland and England had been on again, off again at war. Ever since Edward I had failed to successfully conquer Scotland in the 1280s. As a result, both countries had, governments of both countries had harbored a kind of culture of lawlessness along the border to keep the border region unstable, so that the other guys couldn't use it as a base to launch an invasion, right? So every once in a while, Scotland would invade England, England would invade Scotland, but as long as the border region is unstable, it makes the invasion more difficult. So for hundreds of years, raiding across the border has become encouraged by both governments. As a result, economically, neither side of the border relied much on farming because if people burn your fields, you go bankrupt. Herding cattle and sheep, though, much easier to do, especially if you can steal cattle and sheep from your neighbors, and kidnapping and ransom. There was a low level of warfare all along the border then for hundreds of years, which forced people to develop very close clan identities, tight-knit extended families that would protect each other from outsiders. Not just raiding across the border from Scotland into England or England into Scotland. By the 1500s, the clans on both sides of the borders would sometimes raid people on their own side of the border, sometimes with the help of people from the other side of the border. So for example, the Nixon clan might make an alliance with the Maccabee clan to raid the Johnson clan on the English side of the border. So when James became James I of Scotland and England, he tried to crack down on border raiding and lawlessness along the Scottish and English border by relocating troublemaking families to Ireland, because he's trying to also continue Elizabeth's policies of colonizing Ireland. So what better way to colonize Ireland than sending a bunch of troublemaking roughnecks to go kick ass in Ireland? So under Cromwell, he greatly accelerated this policy in the 1650s by relocating whole clans to Northern Ireland to try to secure English settlements in Ireland. The problem for these border clans is that the English from southern England looked down on them as barbarians and savages from the north. And because they were Calvinists, they were Presbyterian, not Anglican, they looked down on them for being Calvinists. But the Irish viewed them as foreigners and also hated them for being Protestants. So they were caught between both the English Anglicans and the Irish Catholics, and kind of sandwiched in the middle. In the 1690s, England's Navigation Acts, which we'll talk about later, were amended to protect the English textile industry at the expense of the Irish textile industry. Put a tariff on importing textiles into England, including textiles from Ireland. Many of these border clans in Northern Ireland had really started the textile industry in Ireland and suddenly were wiped out. So since they faced religious persecution and economic collapse in Northern Ireland, starting in the 1690s, they flee to Pennsylvania. And they moved to the backcountry. They start moving into the mountains here to just kind of take land from the Indians, leading to conflict in Pennsylvania between the settlers and the Indians. Initially, the Quakers were very good about negotiating and purchasing land from Indians. They wanted to live peacefully with the Indians, but the Scotch-Irish are just going to see the Indians as savages, barbarians, not Christian, and therefore not worthy of dealing with, so just take the land. So that's going to create divisions and problems in Pennsylvania. But by the 1690s, though, Pennsylvania is flourishing. So the English government is going to try to do in New York and New Jersey what has seemed to work so well in Pennsylvania. They're going to grant religious tolerance and self-governance to the colonists in New York and New Jersey. And that's going to lead to a flood of settlers moving there as well in the early 1700s. So the population in New York and New Jersey, let's see why. Oh my goodness, look at this, by 1775, it's like a really bad case of the chicken pox. Settlements have moved further out west, up into the mountains, all the way up the Hudson River. And it's just, the population just starts to explode. All right, so of all of the colonies, the Middle Colonies had the most religious and ethnic diversity. All right, Low Countries. What becomes North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Georgia is not going to be established until 1732. Let's make sure I get the right date right for Charlestown. Oh. My map. This one doesn't have this on. I think in 1670. All right, so this is actually going to be before before Pennsylvania. So it's going to be another proprietor colony in what becomes, I can't zoom in, North and South Carolina. Low Country. Why is it called the Low Country?
Because it's the lowest.
And yeah, because they're English and they're not terribly original. It's lower down the map than Chesapeake. Also the terrain. It's a lot flatter terrain. You can kind of see on the map here that the gap between the Appalachians and the coast gradually narrows the more you go north. So this is much more just low, flat coastline. It's got a much flatter coastal plain. In fact, if you've followed any of the hurricanes that's hit the coastline in this area in the last 10 years, it's really prone to devastating coastal flooding from hurricanes, which is really gross in the case of South Carolina, because much of the economy in this area here is commercial pig farming. So what happens when there's a lot of flooding upriver amongst these pig farms? The pig poop goes downriver, right? So, and if it's not just downriver, if the rivers are flooding their banks and you've got fields under 3 to 6 feet of water that's got pig poop in it, that's really friggin' gross. So, the low country. So we'll look at geography first here. And of course, also it's got, eventually you get into the Appalachians. All of these places, of course, the kind of western frontier is the Appalachian Mountains. All right, so Lord Ashley Cooper, so 1670. Establishes Charlestown, names it after the king. Not the one who lost his head, the second one. A good natural harbor at the confluence of 2 rivers, which he probably names after himself, the Ashley and the Cooper River. So I'm always able to remember this guy's name pretty easily because my best friend is named Greg Cooper and his wife Terry. Their daughter they named Ashley. Actually, they adopted her. She was already named Ashley, but her name's Ashley Cooper. So not at all like this dude though. She is quite different. So, but what is first looking at motives? What's the English government's motive for establishing the colony down here?
Farming.
That's who the settlers are going to want to do farming. England is looking at this. Spain, Spanish Florida, right? That question on English imperial design.